Hello, I'm Tyshawn, and this is Legacy Liner. Welcome aboard. So, it has been a big delay because I had microphone issues, I had issues with my phone, which is what I'm recording these videos on. But finally, it looks like everything is settled out, and we can finally get back to these passenger stories. So, today, I'm going to tell you the story of the only black family to travel on board the Titanic. And very few people even knew that there were any people of color on board. So, without any further delay, let's get into the story. So, Joseph Laroche was born on May 26, 1886, which would have meant he was about 25 at the time that he would have traveled on board the Titanic. He was born in Haiti, and he was born to a single mother. And even though he only had one parent, don't mistake that for him financially being in a bad place, because his mother worked in trade and she was very successful. From what I read, my opinion, from what I gathered, is that she was somewhere between being on the high end of upper middle class and on the low end of being rich. They were definitely not hurting for money. In fact, whenever Joseph was 15, he got sent to study abroad in Paris. Studying abroad was something that was the best thing a parent could do for their child at that time. And so whenever he was over in Paris, he excelled at his schoolwork. He was said to be a very smart young man. When he was a kid, it was said that he loved to play marbles. And he understood that he came from a family that had a little bit more money than others. So he wasn't, disconnected from reality. After studying for several years, he actually ended up deciding to be an engineer. And once he finished up all of his studies, he ended up meeting a young woman named Juliet. Juliet was born on October 20th, 1889, which would have meant that she would have been about 22 at the time that she boarded the Titanic. Juliet's father actually owned a winery, and her and Joseph met because a friend of his went over to their house for dinner, and it was said that Joseph and Juliet hit it off and just started writing letters, started courting, and finally in 1908 they ended up deciding to tie the knot. This was around the same time that Joseph Laroche would have been finishing up with his studies. After they married, they actually ended up moving into Juliet's father's house. So they lived with him, and it was said that Joseph and his father-in-law got along pretty well. Now, even though things were going pretty good for Joseph at this point in his life, there was one area that he was struggling, and that was in his career. See, even though he had the education, even though he was a smart young man, unfortunately, this was the early 1900s, and he was a man of color. So one of the issues that he ran into was finding a job. Most people didn't want to hire him, or if they did hire him, they paid him significantly less than his white counterparts. One of the jobs that he was able to get was that he actually helped to build the north-south line of the subway in Paris. This line is actually still in use today. Now, fast forward a year after his marriage, him and Juliet ended up having their first daughter, Simone. Simone was born February 19th, 1909. A year later, on July the 2nd in 1910, Juliet would end up giving birth to their second daughter, Louise. Now, this pregnancy was a bit more complicated because she did end up having Louise premature, and this caused Louise to have a lot of health issues. And the medical bills did put a bit more of a financial strain on Joseph and Juliet. And for the first few years of Louise's life, she would suffer from numerous medical or health issues. After a while, Joseph finally got tired of not being able to provide for his family the way that he felt that he could. So he actually convinced Juliet that it would be better off for them to move to Haiti, because there wouldn't be as much discrimination because of the color of his skin. And actually, by this time, his uncle was the president of Haiti. And his uncle had actually offered him a job as a professor at a university as a mathematician. And so this also would eventually turn into him maybe being the headmaster of the school. So even though the job paid good and it was, I guess, a prestigious job, there was still room for growth. And so Joseph was all on board for it. Juliet finally agreed to it, and they decided that in 1913 they would head over to Haiti. But as life tends to do, a curveball got thrown at them. Juliet ended up finding out that she was pregnant with their third child. And after talking it out and, figuring out what would work best, the two of them was still very much nervous about how the last pregnancy had a bunch of complications. So they decided that it would be better to travel now before she gets too far along in her pregnancy than to wait later on when she's, 8 or 9 months, or wait next year and then have to have like a little 3-month-old that they're carrying across the ocean and all the way to Haiti. So they actually sped up their trip to April of 1912. Joseph's mother was obviously excited that she would get to see her son again. She would get to meet her daughter-in-law and her grandchildren. So as a gift, she actually brought them first-class tickets on a brand new luxury liner that was going on her maiden voyage in April. And this liner was the France. The France was actually going on its maiden voyage in late April of 1912. I think it was about 2 weeks after Titanic. And first class tickets, I mean, come on, that's a great deal. But there was one issue with this. The France did not allow children to eat in the dining room with their parents. Now, this sounds crazy in today's time, but you have to remember, in 1912, dinner, regardless of what class you were in, was a very formal, very stiff, and long event. It lasts for hours. There were multiple courses. There was all of this etiquette that you had to follow. And as you could probably imagine, that would be very boring and dull for children. And after a while, they would get a bit antsy or maybe just not in the mood to tolerate this very stiff environment. So I guess this France ship and the shipping line that owned them just made a policy to kind of keep children from getting naughty and running around the dining room. But Juliet was not happy about this at all. She did not want to have to eat separately from her children. And Joseph wasn't thrilled about it either, but Juliet definitely kind of pushed him into saying, like, maybe we should trade these tickets in for another ship. And so that's what Joseph did. He ended up trading in the tickets and got second class tickets on another new ocean liner, also going on her maiden voyage in April, the Titanic. Now, they weren't disappointed by getting second class tickets on the Titanic, because first class tickets on other ships did kind of transfer as second class on Titanic because she was such an extravagant luxury liner. So that was actually rather common. There was a few people that would have traveled first class on other liners but traveled second class on the Titanic, because first class is for rich, but like first class on Titanic, that was like Oprah Winfrey, Bill Gates rich. That was a whole nother level of having money. So they weren't too disappointed in getting second class tickets on the Titanic. However, this did upset Joseph's mother a little bit. She wasn't too thrilled about the fact that Joseph's wife convinced him to trade in the tickets. I kind of relate it to like the wife-mother-in-law relationship, Well, I guess my first class tickets weren't good enough for the little wife, so he had to get another ship to take him over. That kind of thing. And this will be relevant later on. So they end up getting the tickets on the Titanic, and they board in Cherbourg, France. The Titanic was actually too big to dock in Cherbourg. There was no piers there big enough. So she actually had to have two tenders bring the passengers out to the ship. And that would have been the traffic, which would have carried third class passengers and cargo, and the nomadic, which would have carried the first and second class passengers to the Titanic. Once on board, Juliet and Joseph were just thrilled. This huge liner, it's very luxurious. And Juliet actually wrote a letter home to her father. She mailed it off before the Titanic headed out to sea. I think she sent it the next day when they were leaving Ireland. So that's how they were able to mail it off before the ship went out and sank. And in the letter, she says that there were plenty of children on board, that Juliet and Simone were enjoying themselves, and it just seemed to be a rather pleasant voyage. Now, we have to address the elephant in the room. Juliet and Joseph were an interracial couple in 1912 society. And as we all know, this was a very stiff, very, formal, unwelcoming kind of society. So you might wonder, what was it like for them? How were they treated? Well, they got some stares and some dirty looks or weird looks, but it tends to be broken up into two categories. One, it just wasn't the norm. It wasn't very normal to see people of color traveling on ocean liners, especially not one like the Titanic. And Joseph was a very well educated, very well raised man. His uncle is the president of Haiti. He was said to be very well dressed, and his family was well dressed. He was fluent in 3 different languages. He was an engineer. And so it was said that a lot of people were blown away at just how, let's just be honest, he was the perfect Edwardian gentleman. He was handsome, rich, well educated, well connected. So, he definitely caught people's attention in that sense. And Juliet, with her, this was an era where it was thought that if a white woman was to marry a non-white man, it was considered sexually promiscuous. And so it was kind of like something that you were supposed to hide and keep, kind of closeted and not broadcast. But Juliet was very much honest about, her husband. She was proud of the man that she was with. If people complimented her pretty daughters and was like, oh, they're so gorgeous, but they don't, really look white, she would tell them with no hesitation, their father's Haitian. She would walk on Joseph's arm proudly. She was pregnant, and I think there was like a couple of remarks of how she didn't try to hide it. Like Madeline Astor that tried to hide hers a little bit. Juliet didn't. She wasn't ashamed of her husband or ashamed of her children's, paternity or any of that, as she shouldn't have been. And that's one of the things that I liked about them, is that this was a couple that was unapologetically themselves and just did not care what society had to say about it. Some of the other looks they got were obviously just that people didn't approve. People were not, thrilled. This was a very racist era, so it's kind of expected that there would be some people that just didn't approve of them. One of the other things that I do feel like has to get mentioned, because it is a bit relevant to this story, is that Louise and Simone, they were mixed race children, where some people looked at them and thought that they were white, and other people looked at them and thought that they might be mixed. They didn't think they were mixed with black, because they were definitely on the fairer complexion side, but they did kind of question, if they were white or not. It was kind of a half and half situation. And this is another thing that will be relevant later on in the story. So let's jump to the night of the sinking. April the 14th, 11:40 p.m., Titanic strikes the iceberg. Not too long afterwards, the captain has the stewards go and wake up the passengers. There was no PA system, so there was no way to get on a microphone and say, all passengers report to the boat deck. They just had to send the stewards and have them knock on everyone's doors and say, get up on deck, the ship hit an iceberg. And so whenever this happened with the Laroches, Joseph was the only person in this family that was fluent in English. So whenever the steward came in and told them they need to get up on deck, Juliet was a little bit panicked, and Joseph had to tell her, like, get the girls ready, and we need to get up on deck. The ship hit an iceberg. And so as Juliet was getting the girls dressed, Joseph gathered all of their belongings, their valuables, their money, their jewelry, everything, and he put it in his coat pocket. Simone ended up going with Juliet, and Louise ended up going with Joseph. As they got up on deck, there was like a big crowd gathering around them. When I was reading the description, it almost sounds like a mosh pit, at those concerts where everybody's just mashed together like that. That's kind of what was going on, and it was stressing Juliet out because people were bumping into her and squishing her, and she's pregnant, she's got Simone with her, and as they're working their way up on deck, Simone is grabbed, picked up, and put in a lifeboat. Juliet starts screaming, my daughter, I need to go with my daughter, and so they pick up Juliet and put her in a lifeboat as well. Now, once Juliet is in a lifeboat with Simone, she starts to panic, like, where's Joseph, where's Louise? And she looks onto the boat deck and she can see that Joseph has Louise in his arms, and people are crowding around him the same way. Like, there's just a rush of people on the boat deck, and Joseph is trying to work his way towards the lifeboat so that he can hand Louise over to Juliet, and people are squishing so bad that he had to kind of elbow people because they were squashing his daughter. And mind you, Louise is still rather sickly at this point because she was a premature child and had a lot of health issues. And eventually a crew member ended up stopping Joseph and was arguing with Joseph. And Joseph was just saying, I'm trying to hand my daughter over to my wife. Now, this is where a little confusion come in. Some people say that maybe it's just that he didn't believe that Louise was Joseph's daughter because Joseph was a dark-skinned man and Louise was a very light-skinned girl. Maybe they didn't believe that he had a white wife, or whatever the case may be. But for whatever reason, this crew member would not let Joseph get to the lifeboat to hand over his daughter. And so finally, another member of the, not a member of the crew, I'm sorry, another passenger saw this and just grabbed Louise out of Joseph's arms, picked her up, and handed her to Juliet. I guess the passenger heard the argument and was like, why is this crew member arguing? Just take the girl and hand the girl to her mother. But whatever reason, once Louise was in a lifeboat with her mother, Joseph at this point no longer was acknowledging the crew member, and he looks at his wife and tells Juliet, it's okay, there will be lifeboats for everyone, look after our little girls. And with that, he ended up getting lost into the crowd, because at this point in the sinking, I guess this was whenever everyone was on the boat deck, like I said. Juliet herself actually did not see the Titanic's final moments. So even in the early morning, she was still, looking on the horizon here and there to see if she could see the Titanic. I don't know if she maybe had her back turned whenever the ship took its final plunge or what. But once on board the Carpathia, she would not separate from her children. She kept Simone and Louise just glued to her. And like so many other women, she realized that her husband was not coming. He was not rescued. Now, once she got to New York, she actually stayed there for 3 weeks to get treated for frostbite because her boat actually had some water at the bottom, which caused her to get real bad frostbite on her feet. And she would actually have problems with her feet for the rest of her life. But after being there for 3 weeks to recover, she ended up heading back home on board the Chicago to go back to France. As far as the money goes, I've heard 2 different stories, so I'm not 100% sure on which is which. I heard that in the rush of getting his family into the boat, Joseph didn't have time to realize that he needs to hand her his jacket that has all of their valuables and belongings in it. But I've also heard that he took the coat and wrapped it around Louise and handed, when Louise got picked up and put into the boat, they had the money on them, but once on board the Carpathia, it got stolen. But either way, by the time they got to New York, they were penniless. All of their valuables, all of their belongings, including Juliet's wedding ring, because with her weight fluctuating from the pregnancies and getting sick with her last one, her ring was a little bit too big for her finger. And so she actually handed it to Joseph to hold for her, so it would have been with the rest of their valuables and their belongings. Once she arrived back in France, her father was just beside himself with grief. He had a very good relationship with his son-in-law. And once she saw her father, it was said that she broke down and just said, I believed him. I believed him. He told me there'll be boats for everyone, and I believed him. And Juliet actually blamed herself for the death of her husband because she was the reason why they switched the tickets. A few months after the Titanic sank, Juliet ended up giving birth to their son, Joseph Laroche Jr. She named him after her husband. And a few years after that, in like the 1920s, Joseph Laroche's mother actually came to visit them in France. And that was the first time that she ever met her grandchildren. That's the first time that she ever met her daughter-in-law. And it did not go well. It was not a good visit. I guess at some point, something got said about, Joseph would have never been on the Titanic in the first place had you not made him switch the tickets. I guess something like that was said, and obviously this triggered Juliet, who already was blaming herself in the first place. And so once Joseph's mother left, she never saw her grandchildren or her daughter-in-law ever again after that. So let's fast forward to 1940. In France, Hitler and the Nazis were beginning to take over. And this was a time where, your ancestry, if you were not the Aryan race, it was a very dangerous time. And this really stressed out Juliet because now she was worried that people would begin to question the paternity of her children. Because remember, they could kind of pass for white, but some people would look at them and could tell they were mixed. And, that was just a dangerous game to play in Hitler's world. So what she ended up doing was taking all of the pictures of Joseph or anything that was proof that her children had a black father, and she got rid of it. But she loved Joseph. She didn't want to destroy it. She didn't want to burn it or throw it in the trash. So what she did was put it in a suitcase and buried it in the backyard and left it there for 6 years until she was sure that Hitler's reign had completely come to an end. So for 6 years, all of the evidence that she had of Joseph was just buried out in her backyard. Now, as far as the life that her and her children had afterward, Juliet really kind of was a controlling mother, if you will. She would not allow her daughters to date. She would not allow them to marry. It was said that they even slept in the same bed up until Juliet died. She was very much strict on her daughters, on her children, and that actually caused a lot of issues with Joseph Jr. He didn't have that same kind of trauma bond with his mother that Simone and Louise would have had. He wasn't even born yet when the Titanic happened. So it was said that him and Juliet would get into quite a few arguments and altercations because he just wasn't having it. He was not dealing with the overbearingness, if you will. And honestly, we could say that that's creepy or that it's weird that she behaved that way. But one of the things that I want to do a video on is that in this era, when you survived a tragedy like that, there was no mental health or no talk of how to deal with the consequences of it. It was, okay, you survived, shut up, keep moving on. Be thankful that you lived. And so a lot of survivors did extreme things or things that we might consider weird today simply because they didn't have a way of coping with it. Juliet died in Paris on January the 10th, 1980, at the age of 90. Simone died in Paris also on August the 8th, 1973, at the age of 64. Louise died in Paris on January 28, 1998, at the age of 87. In fact, Louise would have been one of the handful of survivors that was still alive whenever James Cameron's movie came out in 1997. Now, whether or not she saw the movie, I can't tell you. I couldn't find anything that said that she did, but most of the survivors that were alive when the movie came out, they didn't want to watch it. There was one survivor, I think she said it the best. She said, "No thank you, I've seen it once, I don't want to do it again." And I think that was about A Night to Remember. So a lot of survivors, they did not want to see a dramatic Hollywood production reenacting what probably was one of the worst nights of their lives. One of the things that I do find interesting is that Louise in 1996 actually visited the Nomadic, the same tender that would have carried her and her family to the Titanic back in 1912. And the Nomadic is actually still around today. You could go to Belfast and actually see the Nomadic. They restored it. One of the biggest disappointments for me in the Titanic community is that you never really hear the story of Joseph Laroche. I myself was into the Titanic for years, and it was quite some time before I realized that there was a black man on board the Titanic. And especially to find out that, he came from a family that had means. And I know that don't seem like a big deal, but I think one of the things about the Titanic that makes it such a powerful event is that everybody can find a passenger on board that they can relate to. Someone where their story kind of means something to them. And I think, it's very important to tell all of those stories. That's part of the reason that I started this channel, was just because if you get the stories out there and keep the stories of the people alive, it will keep the story of the ship alive. And it's just a great way to pay tribute to this beautiful ship and all of the souls that were lost with her. Joseph Laroche, like so many other men on that ship, was hoping to achieve a better life, a better, chances and opportunities for his family. It was tragically cut short the moment that ship hit the iceberg. And all right, that's my story on Joseph Laroche and the only black family to travel on board the Titanic. Come back next time where I will talk about the real Rose of the Titanic. Y'all have a good one.